Killer robots warning. UN says machines are dangerously close to targeting humans. UN warns world is near moral red line as machines move closer to killing humans autonomously. The world is edging towards a form of warfare in which a machine could identify a human being, decide that person meets its targeting criteria, and apply lethal force without a human making the final decision. The United Nations and International Committee of the Red Cross have now issued one of their strongest warnings yet that humanity is approaching that threshold. In a joint appeal issued on August 25, 2026, UN Secretary-General António Guterres and ICRC President Mirjana Spoljaric said technological progress had accelerated while international regulation had failed to keep pace. They warned that humanity is now dangerously close to crossing a moral red line, involving the autonomous targeting of people by machines. A race towards autonomous weapons is already underway. The central warning is not that armies might suddenly deploy science fiction robots that independently declare war. The danger is subtler and much closer. Modern weapons can already automate navigation, surveillance, object recognition, tracking, and elements of targeting. Increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence can potentially allow a weapon to receive information through cameras or other sensors, compare what it detects against a target profile, and act with progressively less input from an operator. Autonomous weapon systems are generally understood as systems that, after being activated, can select and engage targets without further human intervention. That distinction matters. A remotely controlled drone may be highly advanced, but if a person chooses the target and orders the strike, the critical lethal decision remains human. The fear begins when that final connection disappears. Guterres and Spoljaric said autonomous weapons were no longer something belonging to a distant technological future, and warned that a race towards greater autonomy was already underway. They argued that increasingly advanced battlefield technology is widening the gap between what weapons can technically do and what international rules specifically regulate. Why targeting humans is the red line. Allowing an autonomous system to attack equipment is already controversial. Allowing one to identify and attack people raises a much deeper problem. Warfare frequently requires decisions that cannot easily be reduced to a database of visual characteristics or behavioral patterns. A soldier may surrender. A wounded fighter may become legally protected from attack. A civilian carrying a weapon could be participating in hostilities, fleeing danger, moving the weapon for somebody else, or acting for reasons that completely change their legal status. International humanitarian law requires distinction between lawful military targets and protected people. Context can be decisive. The ICRC has argued that these assessments are inherently difficult to turn into mathematical values or machine-readable target profiles. Its analysis points out that determining whether someone is a legitimate target can require judgments about status, behavior, intention, causation, and the circumstances at that exact moment. A machine might recognize a rifle. Understanding why someone is carrying it is another problem entirely. A system could potentially become extremely good at recognizing uniforms, vehicles, weapons, movement patterns, or other indicators. That does not necessarily mean it understands surrender, fear, coercion, injury, mistaken identity, or the countless ambiguous situations that occur during combat. That difference sits at the heart of the argument for maintaining meaningful human control. Autonomous does not simply mean artificial intelligence. The debate is often described as a battle over AI weapons, but artificial intelligence and autonomy are not identical. A weapon might use AI to analyze imagery while still requiring a person to approve a strike. Conversely, relatively simple automated technology can perform tasks without further human input, without possessing anything resembling human intelligence. The decisive issue is therefore not whether a weapon is labeled AI. It is what authority humans surrender to it. The UN has previously distinguished between systems where a human remains directly involved, systems that operate autonomously while remaining under human supervision, and systems capable of performing their functions without human involvement or supervision. Weapons capable of autonomous engagement also predate the recent generative AI boom. Defensive systems can already detect and engage certain incoming threats automatically in tightly defined circumstances. The controversy becomes far greater when autonomy moves from predictable objects such as incoming missiles towards deciding whether an individual person should be attacked. Why militaries want more autonomy? There's a powerful military logic pushing in the opposite direction. Machines do not become exhausted in the same way soldiers do. Computers can process information at extraordinary speed. Autonomous systems could continue operating when communications are jammed, allowing weapons to function, even when a remote operator loses contact. One human could eventually supervise multiple aircraft, vehicles, or robots, rather than manually controlling a single machine. Speed may be the greatest attraction of all. If one military can detect a threat, classify it, and attack within seconds, while its opponent requires a human operator to examine the same information before acting, automation could create a major battlefield advantage. That creates a dangerous strategic incentive. Even governments that dislike completely autonomous killing may fear falling behind countries willing to accept greater automation. The result could resemble an arms race in which each side gradually removes humans from the decision chain, because keeping them there becomes a perceived military disadvantage. Recent U.S. Army analysis, for example, describes the move towards one operator working with multiple AI-enabled drone systems as part of an effort to achieve greater scale and decision speed than humans can manage unaided. The aim does not automatically imply autonomous human targeting, but it demonstrates the wider technological direction of travel. Ukraine has shown how fast drone warfare can change. The urgency surrounding the debate cannot be separated from the extraordinary rise of drones in modern warfare. The war in Ukraine has demonstrated how inexpensive unmanned aircraft can perform reconnaissance, strike vehicles, hunt troops, attack infrastructure, and reshape battlefield tactics. Electronic warfare has simultaneously become crucial, because disrupting the connection between an operator and a drone can neutralize the weapon. Greater autonomy offers one possible answer. A drone capable of navigating, identifying objects, or completing part of a mission independently becomes less dependent on a continuous communication link. That does not mean the autonomous targeting of humans has become routine. There remains an important distinction between a weapon autonomously navigating towards an area, recognizing an object, tracking a previously selected target, and independently deciding that an unidentified person should be attacked. The UN and ICRC warning concerns where this technological progression could ultimately lead. The concern is not merely today's battlefield. It is the direction of travel. The accountability problem could become enormous. War already produces disputes over responsibility. Autonomous weapons could make them harder. If a human commander knowingly orders an illegal attack, the chain of responsibility can at least be investigated through familiar legal concepts. But imagine an autonomous weapon wrongly identifies civilians as enemy fighters. Who made the decision? Was responsibility held by the commander who deployed it, the operator who activated it, the military that purchased it, the company that built it, the engineers who designed the targeting system, or the people responsible for the data used to train its algorithms? Responsibility does not simply vanish because software was involved. States and individuals remain subject to international law. Yet establishing exactly why a complex autonomous system behaved in a particular way, and whether that outcome could reasonably have been predicted, could create formidable investigative and legal difficulties. Guterres and Spoljaric specifically warned that failing to establish clear rules could create a world in which accountability becomes increasingly elusive as responsibility for errors and violations grows harder to establish. Could autonomous weapons make war easier? There is another danger that has little to do with whether a robot can recognize a target correctly. Autonomous systems could alter the political cost of military action. Sending soldiers into battle risks casualties, prisoners, domestic anger, and political consequences. Sending expendable machines changes that calculation. If governments can project force with fewer troops placed directly in danger, some critics fear the threshold for using military power could fall. Swarms of relatively inexpensive autonomous systems could also allow military capability to scale in ways that previously required vast numbers of trained personnel. The consequences would extend beyond major powers. Advanced autonomous technology could eventually become cheaper, easier to reproduce, and easier to modify. A capability initially restricted to wealthy militaries may eventually reach smaller states or armed groups. That is one reason regulation becomes considerably harder after proliferation has already occurred. Software can spread faster than conventional weapons factories can be constructed, There is no global treaty specifically banning these weapons. International humanitarian law already governs warfare and remains applicable regardless of the technology used. But there is no dedicated global treaty establishing universally accepted prohibitions and restrictions specifically for autonomous weapon systems. That absence is becoming increasingly important. Guterres and the ICRC originally called in 2023 for states to negotiate a legally binding instrument by 2026. Their proposed approach would prohibit autonomous weapons whose effects cannot be sufficiently understood, predicted, or explained, and rule out systems designed or used to apply force directly against people, while imposing restrictions on other autonomous weapons. The argument is essentially preventative. Governments have regulated or prohibited weapons before, after witnessing their consequences. Supporters of autonomous weapons regulation want the world to establish boundaries before these systems become widespread. Why 2026 matters. The deadline has now arrived. States spent years discussing lethal autonomous weapons through the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, including another group of governmental experts session in Geneva in March 2026. The discussions have considered how autonomous weapons should be characterized, how human control should function, and what a possible regulatory instrument might contain. Another session of the group of governmental experts is scheduled at the Palais des Nations in Geneva from the 31st of August to 4 September 2026. Then comes an even bigger opportunity. The UN and ICRC have identified the 7th Review Conference of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons in November as the clearest available route for governments to move towards negotiations on a legally binding instrument. Their latest statement is therefore not an abstract warning. It is pressure ahead of an approaching diplomatic decision. The hardest question is how much human control is enough. Even governments that agree humans should remain involved can disagree dramatically over what that means. Consider a weapon operating for several hours across a large geographical area. A human commander activates it and specifies the type of military vehicle it may attack. The system subsequently discovers one matching that profile and destroys it without asking permission. A human established the mission. A machine selected the specific target. Was that meaningful human control? Now imagine the same system searching for people instead of vehicles. The ethical and legal stakes rise immediately. Rules may therefore need to address not merely whether a person technically remains somewhere in the command structure, but how much knowledge and control that person actually has over a specific attack. Restrictions could include limits on where autonomous systems operate, how long they operate, what they can target, how many potential targets they can engage, and whether an operator can intervene or deactivate them. The ICRC argues that weapons not prohibited outright should still operate within strict limits designed to preserve human judgment and control. The nightmare is not a robot becoming conscious. Popular culture has conditioned people to imagine autonomous warfare as machines becoming intelligent, conscious, and hostile towards humanity. That is not the immediate danger. A weapon does not need consciousness, emotion, or evil intentions to kill the wrong person. It only needs authority. A machine can be completely indifferent, obedient, and technically functioning exactly as designed while still producing catastrophic consequences if the criteria controlling its behavior are flawed, incomplete, or inappropriate for the situation it encounters. That makes the autonomous weapons debate fundamentally different from science fiction fears about machines deciding to overthrow humanity. The nearer-term danger is that humans deliberately create weapons capable of making increasingly consequential decisions, because doing so offers a military advantage. The machine does not have to seize control. Humans can hand it over. What happens next? The next few months could determine whether international rules begin catching up with the technology or continue trailing behind it. Guterres has repeatedly argued that decisions over human life must not be delegated to machines. In 2025, he described weapons possessing the power and discretion to take human lives without human control as politically unacceptable and morally repugnant, while calling for a legally binding agreement. The warning is more urgent now because autonomy is no longer merely an academic question about weapons that might someday exist. Military systems are becoming more automated. Artificial intelligence is becoming more capable. Drone warfare is expanding. Competition between major powers is intensifying. and software can evolve far faster than international treaty negotiations. There is still a substantial gap between today's AI-assisted battlefield systems and the image of armies of completely independent machines roaming cities and deciding which humans live or die. Claims that such a world has already arrived would go beyond the evidence. But that is precisely why the current moment matters. The purpose of preventative regulation is to draw the line before crossing it becomes normal. If governments wait until autonomous weapons capable of independently hunting people are cheap, effective, and widely deployed, the argument may no longer be about whether humanity should permit them. It may instead be about whether humanity can ever put them back under control.